Hello and welcome. This is Alexandra Guadano, and I'm here today with Nick Scobbo, who is the Senior Vice President of HR Shared Services at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Thank you for joining us today, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
Nick is here to talk with us today about making the critical decision, HR Shared Services versus outsourcing. So before we get into that discussion, Nick, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. As you said, I'm the Senior Vice President of HR Shared Services at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Previous to that, I've worked in consulting, and previous to that, in HR consulting. And previous to that, I grew up in the compensation and HRIT space. A couple grad degrees thrown in here and there, but largely in the HR space.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. So what are the preliminary points to consider when you first begin to weigh the decision of HR shared services versus outsourcing?
Sure. I mean, I think the most important thing is to attack the problem with the right process, right, and the right guidance in terms of how you make that decision. So from a consulting background, I feel very strongly in structuring the decision in a way that is meaningful. So we took sort of a multi-step approach. I think the most important thing we did is we decided early on what criteria were we going to use to make that decision. And we did that prior to looking at vendors, and we did that prior to conducting our own internal modeling. I think what we did is we focused on what the needs of the business were at the time, what the balance sheet looked like at the time, what the needs for cash were, as well as what our service levels needed to be in a go-forward environment. And we used that to define the criteria. And then from there, we launched into our process. But I thought it was important to maintain up front very clear definition of what criteria are we going to use to make the decision between going with an internal model versus an outside model.
Absolutely. So in your opinion, Nick, what are the pros and cons of both outsourcing and HR shared services?
Well, I think if done correctly, the pros and cons should be sort of the same, right? So if you do an HR shared services model internally, you should make sure that you've got your processes nailed. You should make sure that you're driving as much variability out of processes as possible. You should make sure that you're measuring your success and measuring your results in a way that an outsourcer would. I think if you can narrow the differential between what it looks like to outsource and what it looks like to insource, then I think the difference becomes less evident. Obviously, in an outsourced model, there is some opportunity for labor arbitrage, right? Those opportunities are probably decreasing. And for an organization our size, about 4,000 people, the opportunities for arbitrage there are not huge, right? But it is, there's something to be said for that. It's also something to be said for the standard delivery of metrics and measurements that you can obtain from an outsourced provider. I think on the inside, what can be good and bad, right, is enabling yourself to fit the way the business needs to work, as opposed to fitting yourself into the way an outsourcer needs to work. That can be good and bad. You can enable some bad behavior by doing that, but you can also be a little more flexible to be able to adapt yourself to what the business needs at that time.
So many people would say that outsourcing demonstrates more of a cost savings, but what are some of the risks that a company should really weigh when they're considering outsourcing?
Sure. I think the important thing to think about is cost savings versus what, right? So is it cost savings versus your current state, or is it cost savings versus a more optimal state that may involve an insourced solution, right? So many organizations that are going and looking at an outsourced model for shared services first need to get themselves to at least think about what a shared services model might look like in the future and compare the internal costs versus the outside costs. So first, I think step one is cost savings relative to what? I think some of the risks to outsourcing the HR function, again, are just the ability to flex with the business as the business changes. For example, in our business, There'll be more of a shift towards digital content. There'll be more of a shift in sort of our expandable and addressable market. And how we support that from a human capital perspective is very important. Not to say an outsourcer couldn't allow us to do that, but the opportunity to be more flexible by maintaining that internal presence, I think, for us was valuable.
So I understand that in your current position, in your current company, you recently chose not to take the outsourcing option.
That's correct.
So can you just expand a little bit on the decision-making process behind that?
Certainly. So I talked earlier about the criteria that were going to be important to us, right? And I've been through this process as a consultant and also internally in this role, and I've used the same process, but the decision criteria was different. So for us, for example, squeezing every single penny we can out of the model, cost savings were important, but not at the expense of service. And when we got down to it from, once we conducted the RFP, compared the results against a future state model of internal shared services, the cost savings were there, but they weren't big. And I won't get into specifics, but they were such that the NPV difference between the two models was there, but not enough to justify the risk to upsetting service levels. And so for us, I thought that, and my senior management team thought that it really just didn't, the cost didn't really justify the risk given what we had in place.
Right, I see. So now that you've implemented shared services at your company, what are the key things to consider, you would say, in terms of staffing and the performance of the center?
I think it's a couple things that are really important. One of the things that we did, and I've encouraged this in my consulting career as well, we put a vendor management role, a very senior vendor management role within the HR shared services function. And the reason for that is even though we maintained an in-sourced solution, we do have certain components of which that are outsourced, particularly around the systems compliance, systems development, HR systems development, and some other models of HR. And we felt that given that the model is a bit of a hybrid, it's not fully outsourced, but it's more internal, there is real risk in not managing that vendor relationship the way it should. And I don't mean relationship in terms of driving cost out, that's part of it. I mean relationship in terms of vendor performance. And so we do a few things there. We manage the vendor and we measure the vendor's performance, and we also ask the vendor to measure and manage our performance. So are we enabling the vendor to be successful? Because if we're not, then ultimately in this partnership, we're not going to receive the outcome that we're looking for.
Exactly. So Nick, what are some of the analytics and the metrics that you use to measure the overall performance and success of your shared services center?
Well, I'm going to define shared services the way we define it at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. We've adopted that three-legged stool model where we've got a service center handling a lot of our transactions, inclusive of payroll. We've also got centers of expertise handling some of the design. And so we measure, and we also have a third party that does do some outsourcing for us, particularly around benefits administration. When we measure across that spectrum. So we look at some key human capital metrics with respect to our compensation and benefits design. So things that really we feel move the needle in terms of our human capital effectiveness. So everything from turnover to the extent to which we pay for performance. We conduct a lot of regression analysis to figure out what levers we can pull to increase our value that we're adding from a pay program perspective. On the benefits side, we look a lot at claims cost, and we don't look just at what they are. We actually regress them against a variety of variables to figure out what types of levers we can pull, which has led us to the strategy around wellness. We've looked at a variety of issues for our outsourcing partner for the portion that we do outsource, typical call center type stuff. And I will say that our vendor management role has helped drive that relationship to the point where when we inherited it, it was a lot of red on the page, and now we see a lot of green. And those are typical things that you would expect in a call center, focused on quality as well. And within our own HR shared services administration center, we do look at a lot of payroll metrics to make sure that we're tracking accuracy. We also look at, we take it as a measure of how well we are administering the blocking and tackling. So for example, we looked at the ease with which open enrollment went this past year versus previous years prior to the model. So we looked at calls into this center, we looked at file transfer rates, that kind of stuff. And pretty much across the board, we've seen improvement across all the things that we're measuring.
Excellent. So Nick, if you had to offer one piece of advice to a fellow HR shared services professional who was weighing this critical decision, what would that be?
I think for me, and I think this is advice that's relevant to most folks. When we were weighing the decision about whether to insource or to outsource, we were very open with the people whose jobs would be affected by an outsourcing decision. And when I say open, we told them what we were doing, we told them why, we laid out the criteria, we laid out the business plan, and we laid out the time frame. And these were folks in our shop who would be payroll or HR administration folks whose jobs could really be affected by outsourcing. And we just had to be fair, right? And I think you need to take into consideration the best interests of shareholders, right, as well as your employees, which are ultimately not that different, right? And I think that in this case, fortunately, we were able to maintain an in-source environment. And not that it was all wine and roses. I think we had some folks who were very disappointed that we were even considering outsourcing. But I think now that we, we're clear, I think we've developed a bit more trust with our employees than perhaps we would have had we not involved them in the decision as we went.
I think that's a really poignant piece of advice, and I would love if you could give us a few pointers on how to be transparent and sensitive to those whose jobs may be affected by outsourcing.
Sure. I could tell you it wasn't an easy decision. Our chief HR officer at the time, she thought deeply and very deeply about how transparent to be. But ultimately, we decided to really take that leap and treat people like adults. What we did may not work for everybody, but we literally had a town meeting, town hall type meeting, where we brought in folks whose jobs may be affected, and we showed them the model. So I showed them the internal model, I showed them the outside model. We looked at what the org chart would look like inside versus outside, keeping in mind that even in the inside model, roles were going to change. Right, so even if we did, as we decided to keep things in house, some folks are no longer here when with us, and roles have changed. But we did it in a more conversational manner, as opposed to a sort of top-down. This is what will be, and really tried to help people understand what we were doing and why. They may not have agreed with it. We may not have explained it terribly well, but I think we earned a little bit of trust anyway.
Great. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story. It was a pleasure to speak with you. That's all the time we have for today. This is Alexandra Guadano, and thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.